The conference room at Halverson Aerospace had 11 people in it on the Tuesday afternoon. Brent Halverson decided to humiliate his lead atmospheric chemist in front of two federal program managers. The chemist's name was Dr. Ayanna Cole. She was 36 years old. She had been at Halverson Aerospace for 4 years, hired out of a postdoctoral fellowship at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory to lead a project that NASA had funded under a 5-year cooperative agreement worth $31 million over its lifetime. The project was an instrument package designed to detect specific trace gases in the upper atmospheres of icy moons, with a current development target of the Europa Clipper mission's follow-on probe, which NASA had been planning since 2022. The instrument was Ayanna's design. She had developed the core spectroscopic approach during her doctoral work at Caltech and had refined it during her postdoc, and she had been the named principal investigator on the original proposal that had brought the funding to Halverson Aerospace in the first place. She was not, in formal title, the project lead in the company's organizational chart, because Halverson Aerospace did not assign principal investigator titles to scientists below the rank of senior director, and Ayanna held the title of staff scientist. Functionally, however, she was the project. The 11 other people in the conference room that Tuesday afternoon understood this. 2 of them, the senior program manager from NASA headquarters and the deputy program manager from Goddard Space Flight Center, both of whom had flown in for the quarterly project review, understood it with particular clarity. The 2 NASA managers had been working with Ayanna for 19 months. They had been working with Brent Halverson, by contrast, for the duration of approximately 3 conference room meetings, which was the rate at which Brent typically engaged with technical projects he had not personally originated. The 2 NASA managers had a clear sense by Tuesday afternoon of who was running the project. They were waiting, with the kind of patience federal program managers learn to develop in their second year on the job, to see what Brent Halverson was going to do during the quarterly review. What Brent Halverson did was decide to take credit for a result Ayanna had just presented. And when she had quietly corrected him on a technical point, he had decided, in the small, careful way men of his particular kind decided such things, to teach her, in front of her funders, what he considered to be a lesson. Brent Halverson was 62 years old. He had founded Halverson Aerospace in 1996 with the proceeds of his exit from a previous company, where he had been the 3rd employee. He had built Halverson Aerospace into a $600 million small to medium space systems integrator over the following 28 years, with prime contracts at NASA, the Department of Defense, and 3 commercial satellite operators. He was, by the reckoning of the trade press, one of the small handful of self-made aerospace executives in the United States who had built a credible mid-tier prime contractor from scratch in the modern era. He believed several things about himself that were true. He also believed several things about himself that were not true. The thing he believed about himself that was not true, and that the previous 9 years of his leadership had quietly worked to confirm, was that the technical decisions made at Halverson Aerospace were in some causal sense his technical decisions, regardless of whether he had been in the room when they were made. The actual technical decisions at the company were made by approximately 40 senior engineers and scientists, who had learned over the course of their tenures that Brent's instinct on any given engineering question was sometimes correct and sometimes catastrophically wrong, and that the work of running an aerospace company under Brent's leadership consisted in significant part of routing around the moments when his instincts were the second kind. Ayanna Cole had been hired in part because Brent had, in 2020, decided that he wanted Halverson Aerospace to compete for planetary science instruments, which had been a part of the NASA portfolio the company had previously not been in. The hiring decision had been made on the recommendation of his head of advanced concepts, a careful woman named Dr. Rebecca Sandoval, who had argued in writing for 6 months that the company needed to bring in someone with original spectroscopic chops if Halverson Aerospace was going to win the kind of work Brent wanted to win. Rebecca had identified Ayanna from a JPL postdoctoral cohort. Ayanna had been considering 3 offers at the time and had taken Halverson's because Rebecca had personally promised her that she would have technical authority over the project she had been hired to lead, and that her instrument design would not be subjected to the kind of executive-level interference that had driven 2 of her postdoc colleagues out of similar industry positions in the previous 18 months. Rebecca had delivered on the promise for the first 3 years. In year 4, Rebecca had been diagnosed with a slow-progressing autoimmune condition that had required her to step back from her role as head of advanced concepts and into a part-time advisory capacity. Her replacement, a man named Greg Polanski, who had been hired from outside the company, had a different working relationship with Brent. Greg's working relationship with Brent involved deferring to Brent on questions Greg had not been trained to recognize as questions Brent should not have been consulted on. This had been one of the structural conditions that had set the conditions for the Tuesday afternoon meeting. The other structural condition was the cooperative agreement itself. The $31 million instrument development contract that Ayanna led had been written under what NASA referred to as a cooperative agreement with substantial involvement, which is a category of federal award distinct from a standard contract, and which carried specific provisions about the relationship between the principal investigator, the institution, and the funding agency. One of those provisions, which had been negotiated into the original award by NASA's contracting officer with the consent of Halverson Aerospace's general counsel 4 years earlier, was a clause that permitted NASA to redirect the award to a successor institution in the event of certain enumerated circumstances, including the loss of the named principal investigator from the original institution. The clause had been considered by Halverson Aerospace's general counsel at the time, a standard boilerplate provision that was unlikely ever to be triggered. The general counsel had not been wrong about its triggering frequency in the abstract. He had been wrong, as became apparent in the days following the Tuesday afternoon meeting, about whether Brent Halverson's particular leadership style might create the conditions under which the clause would be triggered specifically. The quarterly project review on Tuesday had begun at 1 p.m. It had been scheduled for 4 hours. The first 90 minutes had been Ayanna presenting the technical status of the instrument, development, including a new result her team had generated in the previous 6 weeks on the detection limits for hydrogen cyanide in a simulated Europan plume environment. The result was significant. It demonstrated that the instrument, as currently configured, would achieve a detection sensitivity approximately 4 times better than the requirement specified in the original mission proposal. Ayanna had presented the result clearly. She had described the methodology, the calibration approach, and the statistical confidence interval. She had also been careful to credit by name the 3 junior scientists on her team who had run the bench tests over the previous 6 weeks. The senior NASA program manager, a woman in her 50s named Dr. Patricia No, who had been at NASA headquarters for 16 years and who had personally signed off on the original award, had asked 2 follow-up questions. Ayanna had answered both. Dr. No had then said, in the careful tone she used in formal program reviews, "Ayanna, that is an exceptional result. Thank you for the presentation. Brent, do you have any comments before we move to the schedule update?" Brent had been waiting for the question. He had not, in any meaningful sense, listened to Ayanna's presentation. He had been reviewing the burn rate slides for an unrelated project on his tablet during the last 20 minutes of her talk. He had heard the words 4 times better than the requirement. He had decided to respond to those words. He had said, in the rolling baritone he used during program reviews, "Patricia, I appreciate the team's hard work on this. I want to take a moment to give the broader context. When we structured this program 4 years ago, I told my leadership team that we needed to deliver a detection capability that was meaningfully better than the proposal requirement because I believed, and I still believe, that the science return on this mission was going to be driven by the gap between requirement and actual performance. The team has been working toward that vision. I am glad to see the early results bearing it out. We are going to continue to push hard on this. There is more sensitivity to be unlocked." The room had gone quiet for approximately 3 seconds. Ayanna had set down the laser pointer she had been holding. She had said, very carefully, "Brent, thank you. I'd like to make one small clarification for the record. The 4 times better detection sensitivity result is not driven by an architectural decision made at program inception. The original proposal architecture was designed to meet the requirement exactly. The improvement comes from a calibration refinement my team developed in the last 6 weeks, specifically a noise floor reduction in the 3rd stage photomultiplier output. It's a result of bench-level optimization. I want to make sure the team gets the credit for it on the record, because it's their work." Ayanna had not raised her voice. She had not been confrontational. She had said the thing she had said because the thing she had said was technically correct. And because she had spent 4 years at Halverson Aerospace learning what it cost not to say technically correct things in front of program managers from federal agencies that were going to be reading the meeting minutes the following week. Brent's face had done a small particular thing. He had said, "Ayanna, I appreciate the correction. Let me tell you what I think the difference is between someone who does bench work and someone who runs a program. The person who runs a program is the person who creates the conditions under which bench work happens. I created those conditions 4 years ago when I made the strategic decision to invest in this capability. I have been doing this for 28 years. I know the difference between calibration noise and program vision. With respect, you do not yet. You are doing good work. You will, in time, learn the difference. In the meantime, I would appreciate it if you would not undercut your own management in front of our most important customer. Patricia, please continue." Dr. Patricia No had not continued. She had looked at Brent for approximately 4 seconds. She had then looked at her deputy program manager from Goddard, a careful man in his 40s named Dr. Anthony Burrell, who had been taking notes on his laptop throughout the meeting. They had exchanged a single glance. Anthony had closed his laptop. Patricia had said, "Brent, thank you. I think we will pause the technical portion of the review here and pick up the schedule update tomorrow morning if that works for the team. I have a conflict that I had not factored into the afternoon. Ayanna, please send me the slide deck this evening. We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. Brent, would you walk us out?" Brent had said. Of course, Patricia." He had walked them to the lobby. He had returned to the conference room 12 minutes later with the small, satisfied expression of a man who believed he had managed a situation. The meeting had broken up. Ayanna had walked back to her office. She had closed her door. She had sat at her desk for 15 minutes without moving. Then she had emailed the slide deck to Patricia. She had not added a cover note. She had gone home at 6:14 p.m. What Ayanna did not know, what she had no way of knowing as she drove home that Tuesday evening, was that Dr. Patricia No had spent the previous 14 months quietly preparing for the possibility that the cooperative agreement at Halverson Aerospace might need to be redirected. Patricia had been aware, since approximately Ayanna's 3rd year at the company, of a pattern in the quarterly reviews that had concerned her, a slow shift in the way Brent Halverson talked about the project, from his initial position of letting the technical team present the work to a more recent position of inserting himself into the narrative in ways that did not match the actual contributions being made by the named team members. Patricia had not, until that Tuesday, observed a moment that crossed the line from concerning into actionable. Brent's response to Ayanna's correction had crossed it. The phrase, "the person who runs a program is the person who creates the conditions," had been the line. Patricia had been a program manager for 16 years. She knew, with the careful clarity of a federal official whose job required her to make these distinctions for a living, that a principal investigator who was being talked over by her institution's leadership in front of her funding agency was not a principal investigator who was being institutionally supported. She had also known by 4 p.m. that Tuesday afternoon that NASA had options. Patricia had spent the evening of that Tuesday on the phone. She had spoken with the contracts officer at NASA headquarters who had drafted the original cooperative agreement, who had pulled the language of the redirection clause and had walked her through the procedural requirements for invoking it. She had spoken with the Deputy Associate Administrator for the Science Mission Directorate, who had been on the agency's senior leadership team at the time the award had been issued, and who had remembered the proposal personally. She had spoken with the contracting officer for a different agreement, a separate award at the California Institute of Technology, under which Caltech operated several JPL-managed instrument development efforts, to confirm that Caltech had the institutional capacity to absorb a redirected award on the timeline Patricia was considering. She had spoken with the head of JPL's Planetary Instruments Office, who had known Ayanna from her postdoc, and who had said, when Patricia had described the situation in general terms, that JPL would be honored to host the work and that the institutional infrastructure for the redirection could be in place within 72 hours. By 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time that Tuesday, Patricia had completed the calls she needed to complete. She had drafted, on her laptop in her hotel room, a 2-page memorandum to the NASA Chief Financial Officer recommending the redirection of the Halverson Aerospace Cooperative Agreement to the California Institute of Technology. with the named principal investigator transferring with the award. She had attached as exhibits the relevant meeting minutes from the past 6 quarterly reviews, the original award documentation, and the redirection clause language. She had sent the memorandum at 11:14 p.m. The CFO had read it at 7:04 a.m. the following morning. He had approved it by 8:47 a.m. The contracting officer had been instructed to issue the formal redirection notice by close of business that day. The phone call to Brent Halverson came at 10:23 a.m. Wednesday morning. It was placed by the NASA contracting officer, a careful man named Mr. Daniel Reyes, who had been working federal procurement for 19 years and who had handled approximately 40 redirections of this kind during his career. He had a particular telephone voice for these calls, which was unhurried, polite, and entirely free of any indication that the conversation was anything other than routine procurement business. He introduced himself. He told Brent that NASA was invoking Section 7.3 of the Cooperative Agreement. He told Brent that the agreement would be redirected to the California Institute of Technology, with the named principal investigator transferring with the award, effective in 30 days. He told Brent that the remaining unobligated balance on the agreement, approximately $17 million over the next 2.5 years of the original 5-year term, would transfer with the redirection. He told Brent that NASA was prepared to negotiate, in good faith, a reasonable transition payment to Halverson Aerospace for documented costs, already incurred on the program but not yet billed. He told Brent that the formal notice would be delivered by courier to Halverson's general counsel within the hour, and that Halverson had 30 days under the terms of the agreement to either accept the redirection or to file a formal protest under the procurement integrity provisions of the Federal Acquisition Regulation. He paused. He asked Brent whether he had any questions. Brent had a great many questions. He did not ask any of them. He had been a federal contractor for 28 years. He recognized the cadence of the call. He knew, from approximately the second sentence onward, that the decision had been made before the call had been placed, and that what he was hearing was a courtesy notification of an event that had already occurred. He thanked Mr. Reyes for the call. He hung up. He sat at his desk for approximately 12 minutes. Then he buzzed his executive assistant. He asked her to find Ayanna Cole and to send her to his office. The conversation that followed lasted approximately 7 minutes. Brent told Ayanna that NASA had elected to redirect the cooperative agreement to Caltech, and that her position at Halverson Aerospace would, regrettably, no longer be sustainable in its current form. He offered her, with the small particular generosity of a man who had decided to behave well in the small window between an event he could not reverse and the formal documentation of the event, 3 months of severance and a strong reference letter. Ayanna thanked him. She told him that she had not in any way solicited the redirection, and that she had not been aware NASA was considering it. She told him that she would accept the severance and would be willing to remain at Halverson Aerospace for the transition period, to ensure that the documentation and the hardware were appropriately transferred. She told him that she would, with his permission, accept the position JPL was likely to offer her at the conclusion of the transition. Brent agreed to all of it. He stood up. He extended his hand. She shook it. She walked out of his office. What Brent did not say in the conversation, and what Ayanna did not ask about, was the loss to Halverson Aerospace beyond the redirected award itself. The cooperative agreement had been the company's only active NASA Planetary Science Award. It had been the proof of capability that the company had been using for the previous 2 years to position itself for 2 larger forthcoming opportunities in the same portfolio, both of which had been expected to enter the proposal phase the following spring. With the loss of the named principal investigator and the redirection of the existing award, Halverson Aerospace was no longer credibly positioned to bid for either opportunity. The total addressable revenue across the next decade in that portfolio, by the rough estimate of the company's head of business development, at the all-hands meeting Brent convened the following Friday morning, was somewhere between $200 and $400 million. Halverson Aerospace would not capture any of it. The company would continue. The company had other lines of business. The planetary instruments practice that Rebecca Sandoval had quietly built over the preceding decade, and that Ayanna Cole had been the technical center of for the previous 4 years, was effectively over within 72 hours of Brent's comment about calibration noise. Brent did not, in the years that followed, attempt to publicly characterize what had happened on Tuesday afternoon or in the calls that followed. He gave one interview about it 3 years later to an industry trade publication, in which he was asked whether he believed the redirection had been handled fairly. He had said, "I think NASA made the decision they were entitled to make under the contract. I do not agree with the decision. I am not going to relitigate it in the press." He had not said anything more on the topic. He had remained the chief executive of Halverson Aerospace for 2 more years before retiring at 64. The company continued under a new chief executive who restructured the business around defense satellite integration and who had, by the account of trade press analysts 5 years later, stabilized Halverson Aerospace at approximately 70% of its pre-redirection revenue. Brent retained his founder status and his economic interest. He moved out to a property in the wine country north of San Francisco that he had been planning to spend more time at for the previous decade. Ayanna Cole completed the 30-day transition. She accepted the position at JPL. The instrument development work continued, under her direction, at a pace that the trade press subsequently described as unaffected by the institutional change. The instrument was selected 4 years later as part of the payload for the follow-on Europa mission, which entered formal development under a separate phase of the program. Ayanna was the named principal investigator on the flight instrument. The hydrogen cyanide detection limit on the flight unit by the most recent published data was approximately 5 times better than the requirement specified in the original proposal. Slightly better than the 4 times improvement she had presented at the quarterly review the afternoon Brent Halverson had decided to instruct her on the difference between calibration noise and program vision. The improvement had been driven by Ayanna's own account in a peer-reviewed paper published the year of selection, by a further refinement of the noise flow reduction approach that her team had developed at the photomultiplier output stage. The paper had 3 authors. Ayanna was the senior author. She had insisted that the 2 junior scientists who had run the original bench tests at Halverson Aerospace be listed as the first and second authors. They had both, by the time of publication, joined her team at JPL. The first author had a young child. Ayanna had, on a Friday afternoon, a month after the paper's publication, sent the family a card with a small note that read, "For someday," she had not specified what someday was for, she had not needed to.